He's an expert on trauma whose books have resonated with millions of people around the world. In his most recent work, The Myth of Normal, Dr. Gabor Mate takes on what he calls a toxic culture affecting our world. He says it divides us, hurts the most vulnerable, and just as we inherited it, we are passing it on to the next generation. Mate is a Holocaust survivor, unafraid to speak his mind on the injustices he sees around us. Ahead of his appearance today, we had a call and he told me Gaza occupies his heart. Up next, I'll ask Gabor Mate more about that and more about what's wrong with our world and how we can heal it. This is the InnerView. Very grateful to have Gabor Mate on the InnerView. Thanks for joining us from Vancouver. As you told me during that call, Gaza occupies your heart. Tell us more about that. Why does Gaza occupy your heart right now?
Well, first of all, I'm Jewish, and I grew up with a personal history of suffering, anti-Semitism, and the attempted genocide of Jews in Eastern Europe. My grandparents were victims in Auschwitz, and my mother and I almost were sent there when I was an infant. So suffering and what people do to each other has been close to my heart since childhood. In my teenage years, I was a Zionist. I believed in the dream of the Jewish state being reborn in the ancient homeland, until I realized that this dream was accomplished by imposing a nightmare on the local population of Palestinians, who had to be expelled and killed and dispossessed and oppressed in order to realize the Jewish dream. And ever since then, I've been very concerned with the issue. And more recently, what's been going on there, I have to say personally, from the emotional level, it's been the heaviest, darkest time of my life as an adult, for sure.
You were a child when Israel was founded, and for the Palestinians when the Nakba happened. What does it mean when you consider that in a place like Gaza, you have refugee camps within this strip where children are born into refugee camps as refugees, inheriting that status as refugees from their parents, their grandparents, and sometimes even their great-grandparents who were children around about your age at that time in the 1940s. Tell me what that does to shape individuals and a society.
Well, there was a study done by an international psychiatric research group back in 2005 that looked at the level of trauma amongst Palestinian children. And it was very, very high. A lot of bedwetting, a lot of nightmares, a lot of anxiety, a lot of aggressive behaviors towards the parents. Something like 97% of children have been affected by some degree of trauma. So that's what it means to be born behind a barbed wire, to be bombed regularly, as Gaza has been over the years, not to be able to leave, to have no prospects whatsoever, to have parents who cannot protect you. And it's a highly traumatized population, and they look across the barbed wire and they see the fields and the villages where their grandparents and great-grandparents used to live. And it has been called, Gaza has been called by Israeli historians and sociologists, the largest concentration camp in the world. And it's very predictable what's going to happen when you raise children under such circumstances.
Why do we cling so ardently to our stories and our hatreds, whichever side of the fence you're on this?
Well, I think people are hurt on both sides, on all sides. Many people are hurt in the world. And when we're hurt, our default setting is to go to fear. And fear makes our capacity to think rationally, to imagine the situation of the other person, to empathize, very, very limited. We're thinking only about defense, and defense very often means attacking others. And that's kind of a default setting of human beings when they perceive themselves as under attack. And politicians and leaders in every country in the world know how to exploit those fears and to make people support aggressive policies. And that's happened in Israel. It happens all over the world.
You're right about our toxic culture, and you can correct me if I am wrong in any way in trying to define it here, but you talk about the addictions that we have to consumerism, to prescription drugs, to hard drugs, to the internet, to pornography, to the inequality in our societies, racially and economic and otherwise, and the mental health crisis that we have. And this is nested inside of, what you're studying, and a lot of the data comes from sort of Western liberal democracies, right? And is there not an irony that a lot of these wars are waged in the name of those societies seen as civilization against other societies that are deemed sort of inferior?
Well, there's nothing new about that. Colonialism has always meant that the colonialist sees the other person, the other people, as inferior, and it gives them the right to rule over them. And let's face it, no people and no civilization is immune to that. So there are these great empires, and these empires, they always have to believe that they're superior to the local people, so that gives them the right to dominate them. That's just how it works.
If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? If you harm us, do we not revenge? From Merchant of Venice, right? The dehumanization. Shylock, Shakespeare writing about the perspective of the Jew saying, "Hey, I'm a human like you. I'm bound to the same sort of laws of cause and effect as you are." And there is this dehumanization that takes place. It happens with anti-Semitism, and it happens towards the Palestinians. You only have to look at what Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the others have been saying during this conflict. How do you deal with this dehumanization in this modern age, especially given that it has such an impact on populations as it spreads through social media and otherwise?
Well, it's an epidemic, isn't it? And by the way, Ben Gvir, everybody talks about Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but they're just the latest examples. It's been going on in Palestine for 100 years, and as soon as you make a decision that one people has the right to take over somebody else's land, you're going to have this dehumanization. So that didn't start with Ben Gvir. They're just the most extreme and latest manifestations of it. But let's look at world history over the last several decades. 20 years ago or so, you had the war in Iraq, where the Americans were quite content to kill 500,000 Iraqi civilians in the name of what was a complete lie, the weapons of mass destruction. But it was all about domination, wasn't it? It was all about who gets to control the Middle East. And so behind these slogans and behind these ideologies, there's always some kind of imperial imperative. But empires and aggression always needs ideologies. And ideologies, whether they're, the ideology of the Nazi Germany, or the ideology of Western democracies, or the ideology of Zionism, they always need to justify themselves. And the fundamental, so that this has been going on forever and is going on now. The only problem is when we're doing it, we think we're justified. When other people are doing it, we see the error, we see the falsehood. It's very difficult for people to look at their own ideological blind spots and to examine them with open minds.
There's a petrol that is added to the flames in the Middle East by the name of apocalyptic religion. Do you think it's a byproduct of what's been going on, or it's part of the root causes?
Well, every religion, whether it's Judaism or whether it's Christianity or whether it's Islam, has got its beautiful aspects, its universal aspects, its capacity to see humanity, its capacity to look behind the individual ego, to see the universality, the oneness of everything. But at the same time, every religion also has the potential to become tribal, to become aggressive, to become possessive, to become cruel. And this is true of, again, of Islam, of Christianity, and also of Judaism, or any religion we wish to look at. Now, if you look at the Middle East, the fundamentalism that has been rising there for decades, I think it's a direct response to a history of colonialism. In other words, in the West, we like to talk about Islamic fundamentalism, but we don't look at the fact that the rise of fundamentalist movements in the Middle East is very much a reaction to what people experience as unfair oppression from the West. And so that the two are connected. The more you torment people, the more likely they are to go for extreme solutions. That's just how it works.
In your book, you mention and reference that magnificent scene from Good Will Hunting where the Robin Williams character, Sean, the psychiatrist, tells Matt Damon, Goodwill, that it's not your fault, when they're talking about him being beaten by his stepdad. And he says, it's not your fault, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. And he cracks him open. And I think when we look at the geopolitics and the history of the region, we can chart a course when we look at the oppression, the dehumanization, colonialism, exploitation, and so on and so forth. We can contextualize a lot of it. But I wonder, no matter how thinly you slice it, at what point do we also have to accept that sort of personal agency of bad leaders and those in power making worse choices than, bad choices that are worse than good choices? Or should we relegate the individual agency to a second tier? Well,
look, the scene from Good Will Hunting that you quoted, which is between a therapist and a client, and it's a very poignant, beautiful scene, because people who are traumatized always think it's their fault. They're ashamed of themselves. And so Robin Williams, the therapist, says to the character, the client, it's not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not your fault. That works on the individual level. The problem is you can't transpose. Now, you can talk about political leaders as being traumatized. I mean, Hitler was a very traumatized child. I can name you a whole bunch of Western political leaders that were very traumatized children. But they don't come for therapy. They're not looking for help. So there's no point me saying to a Netanyahu, it's not your fault, even if I can understand how he was a traumatized person, or any other political leader, how they were a traumatized person. It doesn't cover it because they're not looking for help. So that helping people recognize their trauma and how they have nothing to be ashamed of works on the individual therapeutic level, but on the political level, you can't use that because those people are not looking for help.
Let me take that a step further then. Let me just take it a step further, because when we have somebody who is maybe a perpetrator of any form of abuse, usually there are elements of guilt or shame or defense mechanisms not wanting to deal with it. And if somebody is a victim of abuse, there are elements of rage and not knowing how to deal with the after effects of that. When it comes to what are defined intractable conflicts, everybody believes they're the victim. Nobody wants to admit that sometimes they're the perpetrator. Sometimes it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So how do we upscale what works for the individual to try and heal societies?
I don't have an answer to that, because in my personal experience, you can only help people who are looking for help. As long as people are stuck in their ideologies, I don't care on which side, Zionists, anti-Zionists, Islamists, anti-Islamists, I don't care which side. As long as they're stuck in ideologies and they're not looking for help and they see themselves only as victims, they cannot be helped. History History will just have to teach them how mistaken their beliefs were. But that takes decades, a long time.
Yeah, we've been talking about the bad guys. There's a quote from a therapist called Terry Real, and I don't want to butcher it, but I probably will, where he says, family pathology rolls from generation to generation like a great fire in the woods, devouring everything in its midst until one person has the courage to stand up and turn back and face the flames. And that person brings peace to his ancestors and spares the children that follow. We've been talking about the bad guys. Who are the healers in global politics right now? Who are the equivalent of that one person to stand up and face the flames and cut this trauma?
Well, interesting you should mention Terry Real, because I was just talking to Terry two days ago. and he's absolutely right. I was traumatized as a kid. I passed on my trauma to my children. I talk about that in The Myth of Normal. I talk about it in my other book. Until we realize that we're traumatized and we're acting out of trauma, we do pass it on. Not because we mean to, not because we don't love our kids, not because we're not trying to do our best, but because we can't help it. So I did. So my adult children have to deal with the trauma that I passed on to them when they were kids. That's just how it works. So it does take somebody waking up and saying, okay, there's this link of trauma, there's this chain of trauma with all these links between the generations, and I want to break that chain of trauma transmission. That's what it takes. Now, on a social level, if you look at, say, the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you want to call it that, although I think that's a weak way to put it, there are people in Israel who are standing up and saying, this is not right. There are journalists, very, courageous journalists like Gideon Levy and Amir Haas. There are who report on what's happening in the occupied territories, who try to tell Israelis what's happening in Gaza. Most people don't listen to them. And Gideon Levy recently talked about what a failure he is, because he's been telling people this for decades and they don't listen. But they're trying. And there are other Israelis. There were Israelis the other day who tried to take some food to the starving people of Gaza. They were attacked by extremists and their trucks were set on fire, and the police and the army stood by and did nothing to protect them. But there are those people, and those are the people who in the long term are going to make a difference.
What's more important, peace or justice?
You can't have one without the other. I mean, look, if Hitler had won the Second World War and he had occupied and conquered Russia and was able to suppress Britain and dominate all of Europe, there would have been peace. An oppressive, unjust, cruel peace. That wouldn't have lasted, but there would have been peace. So there's no peace without justice anywhere in the world. Because as long as there's injustice, people sooner or later are going to resist. So we can't separate the two. And actually, if you look at it on the individual level, when you have behaved unjustly towards somebody else, as I have in my own family or other people that I know, is there peace in my heart? No, there isn't. There's turmoil. So whether we're looking at on the individual level or on the social level, there's no peace without justice.
I asked you to upscale something earlier on. Let's scale up the idea of the toxic culture. Can we say that we have a global toxic culture?
Well, look, if you look at the word culture, it's a scientific word. In a laboratory, if you're growing microorganisms in a petri dish, you call that a culture. You call that a laboratory culture. And if the organisms, the microorganisms in that petri dish, in that culture dish, were thriving, you'd say it's a healthy culture. But if many of them were sick or dying off or showing signs of dysfunction or pathology, you'd say it's a toxic culture. Now, if you look at globalized capitalist culture, the rate of mental illness is going up, depression is going up, suicide is going up, childhood mental health diagnoses like AD, attention deficit, anxiety, depression, aggression are going up. physical autoimmune diseases going up internationally. This is a toxic culture. And the toxicity has to do with the fact that for all the relative wealth of the West, and I'm talking about the North and the West, which is a lot wealthier than the rest of the world, we're still seeing a lot of physical illness. In the richest country in the world, the United States, 70% of adults are at least on one medication, and 40% are on two medications. So it's a very rich but very toxic culture.
In your experience as a physician, as a doctor, you worked in palliative care. You worked with a lot of people at the end of life when there's nothing much that medicine can do except try to give them a dignified exit from this realm. And it's not only old people, it's sometimes young people with terminal illnesses, people in their 20s, 30s, and so on. From those years, tell me about some of the lessons that you learned from those people.
Yes. So Western medicine, for all its miraculous achievements, and it truly is miraculous, makes a fundamental error. It separates the mind from the body. It separates people's emotional lives from their physical health. So I've been to Turkey, and I know this is true there too, but it's true all over the world. When you go see a specialist for a problem, inflammation of your nervous system or your lungs or your skin or your intestines or whatever, they're going to deal with the physical aspects of it, but they're not going to deal with the emotional aspects of it. And then they're going to see how maybe something about your life has contributed to the onset of this illness. And what I saw in family practice and in addiction medicine and in palliative care is that people who got sick, it wasn't just physiological. There were emotional patterns in their lives that contributed to the onset of their illness. And there was a book written by a palliative care nurse in Australia about 15 years ago, which is called The Top 5 Regrets of Dying People. And I saw the same thing all the time. And you know what the biggest regret of people who are dying before their time from autoimmune disease or very often malignancy, the biggest regret was I didn't have the courage to be myself. I suppressed myself. And that suppression of the self, which happens to people in childhood in order so they can fit in with their families, that suppression of emotions and their true selves undermines the immune system. It undermines the nervous system, the hormonal apparatus, because it's all one. The hormones and the nerves and the immunity and the emotions are not separate. They're all one system. And so in the people that develop chronic illnesses and malignancy, usually you find these patterns of self-suppression that, if they're reversed, could very often, and I've seen this, and other people have documented this, could make a big difference to their illness. I'm not saying we could cure everybody, but I'm saying that people could be a lot healthier, even after their diagnosis, if the doctors made this connection between mind and body. But unfortunately, despite all the science that we have now, showing the mind-body unity in actual life, doctors are not trained to recognize it.
Do you believe you've had the courage to be yourself over all these years?
You know, you know what? On the whole, yes. That's why I've been able to do the work that I'm doing, but not always and not consistently. And it's an ongoing work. It's an ongoing work. Believe me, it's work that lasts your whole time, your whole lifetime, to become truly yourself. I think I'm getting there. I think I have a ways to go. But as I often said, I'm 80 years old now, and I wouldn't want to be as young and stupid as I was when I was 79. You know, so it's an ongoing process, and that's life.
Tell me about the next book or the next project, Hello Again, with your son, and about family reconciliation. I don't want to give away spoilers, but tell us a little bit about that before we wrap up.
Sure. So my eldest son, Daniel, and I, to whom I passed on my trauma when he was a small child, he helped me write The Myth of Normal. And The Myth of Normal has been published now in 40 languages around the world. And our next project is called Hello Again, a fresh start for parents and adult children. So it's based on our work with each other It's based on a workshop that we've led together about how to reconcile adult children and their parents when there's been so much misunderstanding and even hurt between them. So that's the book, Hello Again, a fresh start for adult children and their parents.
Gabor Mate, your work is incredible, your body of work is incredible, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to talk to you. I've been a big fan ever since reading a couple of your books. Thank you so much for joining us on the interview. We wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Take care.